The History of Everything You Use, Episode 5. Tea, the leaf that moved nations. Opening. Welcome back. Tonight we continue our slow journey through the histories of the ordinary things that fill our days. The objects and substances so familiar to us that they have become almost invisible. We have followed salt, which built empires, coffee, which woke up the world, sugar, which reshaped continents, and bread, which fed civilization itself. Tonight, we turn to the second most consumed beverage on Earth after water. A drink so quiet, so gentle, that it seems almost impossible to believe how much of world history flows through it. At this very moment, in kettles and pots across the world, water is being brought to a boil for it. In an English kitchen, someone is warming a teapot. In a Turkish home, water is rising in the twin-tiered çaydanlık. In a Japanese tea house, powdered green leaves are being whisked into froth in a small ceramic bowl. In a Moroccan glass, mint has been layered over gunpowder pellets, and the pouring stream is being raised high above the tray, so the liquid foams as it falls. In a Russian samovar, brewed concentrate is being diluted with hot water into a glass. In an Indian street stall, milk and spices and leaves and sugar are being boiled together into masala chai. The same leaf, the same species. All the way back to a single genus of small tree that grows in the mist-covered mountains where southwestern China meets Burma and northeast India. Tonight, we are going to talk about tea. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back with mine. Through gardens and monasteries, through porcelain cups in iron kettles, through wars fought over it, and revolutions started with it, to a time when the leaf we now brew so casually was still a wild forest secret. Part 1. The leaf that chose China. The tea plant, Camellia sinensis, is a modest evergreen shrub with glossy dark leaves and small white flowers. Left alone, it grows into a small tree. Cultivated for its leaves, it is kept clipped low as a bush. Its native range covers a wide arc through the mountains of what is now Yunnan province in southwest China, extending into northern Myanmar, northeastern India, and the highlands of Laos and Vietnam. Somewhere in this misty tropical borderland, our ancestors first noticed that the young leaves of this plant, when steeped in hot water, produced a fragrant drink that seemed to sharpen the mind and calm the body at the same time. Chinese tradition places tea's discovery in almost mythical antiquity. The legend attributes it to Shennong, the divine farmer who is credited with teaching the Chinese people agriculture and herbal medicine. Shennong, so the story goes, was one day boiling water in the shade of a wild tea tree. A few leaves drifted down into his pot. He tasted the resulting infusion, found it wonderfully refreshing, and thus discovered tea. The date offered is often given as around 2737 BC, a symbolic number rather than a historical one. The archaeological reality is more modest but no less remarkable. Researchers in 2016 announced that they had identified tea residue in ceramic vessels from the tomb of a Han Dynasty emperor, dating to around 141 BC. This makes it the oldest scientifically confirmed evidence of tea drinking anywhere in the world. Tea, by then, had already moved from wild forest curiosity to an item worthy of an emperor's tomb. For centuries, the Chinese drank tea primarily as a medicine. It was prescribed for headaches, for digestive troubles, for fatigue. And then, during the Tang dynasty, which ruled China from the 7th to the 10th centuries AD, tea underwent an extraordinary transformation. It became not just a medicine, but an art. The great figure of this transformation was a man named Lu Yu, who lived in the 8th century AD. Orphaned as a child, raised in a Buddhist monastery, Liu Yu grew into a scholar with an obsessive interest in every aspect of tea. He walked across China, visiting tea gardens and springs. He tasted, he compared, he ranked. And around the year 760, he wrote what is now regarded as the first great book on the subject, the Cha Jing, or Classic of Tea. The Classic of Tea is a small masterpiece. It describes the plant itself, the tools for growing and processing the leaves, the correct methods for brewing, the qualities of different waters. Liu Yu ranked the waters of famous springs and rivers in order of preference, and the aesthetic and philosophical dimensions of tea drinking. Under his influence, tea became one of the great cultivated pleasures of Chinese civilization, alongside calligraphy, poetry, and painting. To brew tea well and to serve it well was to demonstrate refinement of character. Under the following Song dynasty, tea drinking reached another height. The Song aristocrats developed the art of powdered tea, grinding the dried leaves to a fine green dust and whisking it into hot water with a bamboo whisk to produce a bright, frothy drink. This is important because from Song China, along with Chan Buddhism, the meditative school we know today by its Japanese name Zen, this powdered tea would travel across the sea. Part 2. The Way of Tea in Japan. Tea reached Japan several times, but the moment that mattered most came in the 12th century, when a Buddhist monk named Eisai returned from studies in Song China, carrying tea seeds and the practice of drinking powdered green tea. He planted the seeds in temple gardens. He wrote a treatise arguing that tea was a health tonic ideal for meditation. And within a generation or two, tea drinking was spreading through Japanese Buddhist monasteries, then through the warrior aristocracy, then into the wider culture. But what happened next was uniquely Japanese. Over the following centuries, tea in Japan was slowly transformed from a beverage into a discipline. Zen monks and tea masters developed an elaborate ritual around the preparation and drinking of matcha, the powdered green tea of the Song, in which every gesture, every object, every moment carried aesthetic and spiritual weight. This is what became known as Chado or Sado, the way of tea. The greatest of the tea masters was Sen no Rikyu, who lived in the 16th century and served the powerful warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Rikyu took the tea ceremony to its most refined and paradoxical form. He rejected ostentation. He preferred small, dim tea huts entered through a low doorway that required even the greatest lord to bow. He preferred rough, imperfect ceramic bowls to polished porcelain. He crystallized around the ceremony a set of aesthetic principles, wabi and sabi, roughly meaning humility and the beauty of imperfection and time, that continue to shape Japanese art to this day. Under Rikyu, drinking a bowl of green tea became one of the most philosophically rich acts in world culture. Rikyu's story ended, as many stories of counselors to warlords do, tragically. Hideyoshi, offended for reasons that historians still debate, ordered Rikyu to commit ritual suicide. Rikyu prepared one final tea ceremony for his closest friends, gave away the beautiful objects he had used, and then took his own life. And yet the way he had shaped continued, and continues today, in every quiet Japanese tea room. Meanwhile, back in China, tastes had shifted. During the Ming dynasty, from the 14th century onward, the Chinese moved away from powdered tea toward loose leaf tea, the whole dried leaves steeped in hot water in a teapot. This is essentially the way tea is now drunk almost everywhere in the world, except the Japanese tea ceremony. When Portuguese and Dutch ships began arriving in Chinese waters in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was the tea they encountered. Part 3. Tea enters Europe. The story of how tea reached Europe is a story of a slow, cautious westward drift, driven by trade. Portuguese ships in the 16th century were the first Europeans to encounter the drink in earnest, but it was the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th century that first brought commercial quantities of tea back to Europe. Small consignments arrived in Amsterdam around 1610. At first, tea was a curiosity, sold in apothecaries, its properties debated by physicians. England came to tea late by European standards. The first coffee house in London had opened around 1652, and coffee was already fashionable. Tea, when it appeared in the same coffee houses around 1657, was slower to catch on. But then, in 1662, a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England, and everything changed. Catherine had grown up drinking tea. Portugal, thanks to its Asian trade, was the earliest European tea-drinking nation, and she brought her habit with her to the English court. Around her, the aristocratic ladies of England began to drink tea. From court fashion, the habit trickled outward. For decades, tea remained expensive. It was taxed heavily. It was locked away in ornate little wooden boxes called tea caddies, which the lady of the house kept the key to, just as her medieval predecessor had guarded the sugar chest. But throughout the 18th century, the East India Company brought back ever larger cargoes of tea from Canton, and prices slowly fell. By the middle of the century, tea had passed from luxury to daily habit for the middle class. By the end of the century, it had reached the working class as well. And in the 19th century, tea would become what it remains today, the national drink of Britain. There is a striking economic point buried in this transformation. In 1700, the British East India Company imported roughly 6 tons of tea. By 1800, it was importing more than 11,000 tons. Something profound had happened to the everyday life of an entire people, driven by cargoes coming from ports thousands of kilometers away. And with these cargoes came the other great commodity we have already discussed, because tea, in the British style, was drunk sweetened. Sugar and tea rose together. The two habits fed each other, and the same Atlantic economy of enslaved labour and plantation agriculture that produced the sugar was, in effect, sweetening every English cup. Part 4. The Chinese Trade Problem. By the 18th century, a serious trade problem had begun to develop between Britain and China. The British, and by extension all of Europe, wanted enormous quantities of Chinese goods. Tea above all, but also silk, porcelain, and lacquerware. The Chinese emperors, however, were famously uninterested in European goods. When British envoys arrived in Beijing, offering the finest of British manufactures, they were received politely and told that China had no need of anything foreigners produced. This left one problem. How would Britain pay for its tea? The answer, for most of the 18th century, was silver. Vast quantities of silver flowed from British ships into Chinese ports and stayed there. This drained British treasuries and worried British statesmen. Something had to balance the trade. The something the East India Company found, terribly, was opium. Beginning in the late 18th century, the company began to grow opium in Bengal, in India, on an industrial scale, and then to arrange for its smuggling into China through private merchants. Opium addiction spread rapidly through Chinese coastal populations. The flow of silver reversed. By the 1830s, silver was flowing out of China to pay for the drug, and Chinese authorities were alarmed both by the addiction of their people and by the economic damage. In 1839, the Qing government appointed a firm and honest official named Lin Zexu to end the trade. Lin confiscated more than 1,000 tons of opium from British warehouses in Guangzhou and destroyed it by dissolving it in seawater. He wrote a famous, dignified letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her moral sense to stop the trade, a letter that never reached her. Britain responded with warships. The First Opium War, from 1839 to 1842, ended with a crushing British victory. China was forced to open several ports to foreign trade, to pay a large indemnity, and to cede Hong Kong to Britain, the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. A second Opium War, from 1856 to 1860, forced further concessions. The tea in an English porcelain cup, sweetened with sugar from a Caribbean plantation, was, in this darker sense, also paid for in Chinese suffering. There is no way to talk honestly about the history of tea in the West without this chapter. The genteel afternoon ritual of a Victorian drawing room and the smoke of opium in a coastal Chinese city were, in strict economic terms, two ends of the same rope. Part 5. Tea escapes China. For centuries, the Chinese had guarded the secret of tea cultivation almost as jealously as the Yemenis had once guarded coffee. But by the mid-19th century, Britain, having fought 2 wars to secure its tea supply, was determined to break Chinese monopoly for good. It would grow its own tea, in its own colonial territories, using its own labour. The task of stealing tea from China fell to a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune. Between 1848 and 1851, Fortune travelled through the great tea-growing regions of China in disguise, dressed in Chinese clothes, his head shaved into a queue, accompanied by Chinese servants who spoke for him. He collected thousands of tea seeds and plants. He memorized processing techniques. He recruited experienced Chinese tea workers to teach the trade elsewhere. He then transported the seeds, the plants, and the workers to India. The plants he brought did not thrive well in their new home. But it turned out that the British did not need Chinese plants at all, because in the 1820s, in the hill country of Assam in northeast India, a British soldier named Robert Bruce had already noticed local tribespeople brewing a drink from the leaves of a wild tree. That wild tree, it was eventually established, was a distinct variety of the same species, Camellia sinensis veris assamica. The tea plant had never been solely Chinese. India had its own variety, growing wild all along. The next 50 years transformed the northeast Indian landscape completely. British planters cleared vast tracts of Assam forest and planted them with tea. Workers, many of them poor migrants from other parts of India, recruited under coercive contracts that resembled indentured servitude and sometimes crossed into it, were brought in by the tens of thousands to work the plantations. By 1900, India was producing more tea than China had ever exported. And a decade or two later, Britain was drinking almost exclusively Indian tea. The neighbouring highlands of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, were also converted to tea after a coffee leaf blight devastated their coffee plantations in the 1870s. Meanwhile, tea was also spreading through the Russian Empire. Russia had traded caravan tea across Siberia from China for centuries, developing a rich tea culture of its own around the samovar. Turkey, after losing much of its coffee-supplying territory in the early 20th century, began to cultivate tea on the eastern Black Sea coast and rapidly became one of the most tea-drinking nations per capita in the world. The plant that had been contained in one corner of Asia for millennia was, within a couple of generations, growing on nearly every warm hillside from Georgia to Kenya to Argentina. Part 6. The tea that started a revolution. We have talked so far of Britain's tea, of China's tea, of India's tea. But tea also once helped ignite a revolution in a place we have not yet visited. Because the story of the American Revolution is, in one important sense, a tea story. In the mid-18th century, tea was extremely popular in the American colonies. But the tax structure imposed by London made legal, taxed tea more expensive than smuggled tea from Dutch merchants. Enterprising American merchants, most famously John Hancock, grew rich in the smuggling trade. When Parliament in 1773 passed the Tea Act to help the financially struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell directly to American consumers, cheaply and with a small tax, the response in America was fury. The fury was not really about the price of tea, which the Tea Act actually lowered. It was about the principle of the tax itself, no taxation without representation, and about the threat posed to American smugglers by cheap official tea. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of Boston colonists, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 East India Company ships in Boston Harbor. Over the course of a few hours, they broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the sea. The Boston Tea Party is one of the most famous acts of political theatre in history, and it worked. The British responded with punitive laws, called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and imposed direct rule on Massachusetts. Colonial resistance hardened. Within 2 years, the colonies were in armed rebellion, and within a decade, they were an independent nation. But there is a smaller, more lasting consequence of the Boston Tea Party that is often overlooked. In its aftermath, and for years afterward, drinking tea in the American colonies came to seem politically suspect, a symbol of loyalty to the crown. Patriots switched to coffee. And so, in one of history's small, ironic turns, the reason the United States became a coffee-drinking nation, while Britain remained a tea-drinking nation, traces back, in part, to a night in Boston Harbor 250 years ago. Part 7. The Rituals of Tea. By the 20th century, tea had settled into distinct national rituals, each with its own quiet magic. In China, tea drinking remained an art form. Gongfu tea, in which small clay teapots and thimble-sized cups are used to brew concentrated tea in a series of quick infusions, became a hallmark of southern Chinese hospitality. In Japan, the tea ceremony continued to hold its meditative place at the highest end of the culture, while ordinary green tea sat on every family table. In Britain, tea underwent a curious institutional evolution. In the early 19th century, an aristocratic lady named Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, is credited with popularising the idea of a small meal of tea, bread and cake taken in the late afternoon to bridge the long gap between lunch and dinner. Afternoon tea, taken in drawing rooms with fine porcelain and silver services, became a social institution. Later, in industrial northern England, the working-class version, high tea, taken with substantial hot food after a day's labour, evolved separately, and the two names have caused confusion ever since. In Russia, the samovar, a metal urn kept always simmering with hot water, produced the traditional 2-part Russian tea. A small pot of very strong brewed concentrate, called zavarka, diluted at the table with hot water from the samovar to each drinker's taste. In Turkey, the double-tiered çaydan look borrowed the same principle: concentrated tea above, hot water below, and tea drunk from small, tulip-shaped glasses became a constant background of daily life, poured for every guest, every conversation, every transaction. Turkey today drinks more tea per person than almost any other country on earth. In Morocco, mint tea, green Chinese gunpowder tea brewed with fresh mint and a great deal of sugar, poured from a height into small glasses to create foam, became the drink of hospitality across North Africa. In India, colonial-era planters and the Indian Tea Association encouraged domestic tea consumption in the 20th century, and Indian street vendors created what is now one of the most beloved forms of tea in the world, masala chai, in which tea is boiled with milk, sugar, and spices like cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, and clove. Every one of these rituals looks, on the surface, different, but peer into them all and you find the same simple substance: dried leaves of a small tropical tree wilted in hot water. The same species, the same original forest. Part 8. The bag that changed everything. The last great transformation of tea came quietly in the 20th century, and it happened in New York. Around 1908, a tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan began sending small silk pouches of tea samples to his customers as a way to distribute product cheaply. His customers, apparently misunderstanding, put the entire pouches into their hot water and, to their own surprise, found the arrangement convenient. Sullivan received requests for pouches designed to work this way. The tea bag was born. Through the 20th century, tea bags took over. Cheaper materials, paper filters, and later various plastic or plant-based fibers replaced silk. The bags spread first through American offices and hotels, then through British households after the Second World War. Today, the vast majority of tea consumed in Britain and the United States is brewed from bags. Tea companies redesigned their leaf grades to suit the format. The fine, dust-like tea that fills the bag, called fannings or dust in the trade, extracts quickly but at the cost of the subtle qualities that whole leaf tea offers. The daily English cuppa became something rather different from what it had been a century before. And once again, as with coffee before it, a counter-movement has arisen in recent decades. Specialty tea shops, importing whole leaf teas directly from small producers, have brought the older forms of tea back into fashion. Chinese oolongs, Japanese sencha and gyokuro, Taiwanese high mountain teas, Indian first flush Darjeelings. The tea in the ceramic pot of a modern tea enthusiast is, in a real sense, closer to the tea of Lu Yu's classic of tea than to the tea of a supermarket cardboard box. Closing. And so we return, one more time, to the ordinary. To the cup of tea that, somewhere in the world, right now, someone is lifting to their lips. It looks so quiet, so mild. Warm water and a leaf. But you know its secret now. You know that it began in wild forests where China meets Burma, that Chinese emperors were buried with it, that Lu Yu wrote a small, perfect book about it under the Tang dynasty, and that in Japan, a tea master named Senno Rikyu raised the drinking of it to one of the most philosophically refined acts in human culture. You know that Portuguese princesses brought it to English courts, that it drew from British treasuries so much silver that opium was smuggled into China to balance the trade, and that 2 wars were fought over it in the 19th century. You know that it was stolen from China by a botanist in disguise, transplanted to India, and that entire hillsides in Assam and Ceylon were reshaped to grow it. You know that a night in Boston Harbor, when chests of it were dumped into the sea, helped begin the American Revolution, and that the reason Americans drink coffee while Britons drink tea traces back to that same night. You know that in Turkey and Russia and Morocco and India, entirely different daily rituals grew up around the same little leaf. Tea teaches us the quiet lesson of this series once again, that the most gentle of substances can move the largest of nations. That an act so simple, pouring hot water over dried leaves, has carried on its slow, warm current kings and revolutionaries, monks and merchants, poets and politicians, for the better part of 2,000 years. The next time you cradle a warm cup in your hands, remember for just a moment everyone who has done the same before you. You are part of a very long, very calm conversation. Sleep well, and when we meet again, we will follow the story of another treasure that once cost fortunes and started wars. The small, fragrant substances that drew Europeans across oceans and reshaped the map of the world. Spices. Until then, Good night.